Welcome to the video lecture for A Jury of Her Peers by Susan Glaspell. This one will work a little differently insofar as I'll be referring to page numbers, not paragraph numbers, and this is because this story is available to you from an external link. So, let's begin on page 256. Why does the narrator use the word scandalized in that very first paragraph? Does this suggest that we should be thinking in terms of foreshadowing? Is something else in this story a scandal or scandalized? And we should note that the narrator is in the head of Martha Hale at this time. In terms of plot, through page 257, it's established that several people are going to visit the Wrights. And remember, in terms of quizzes, you really do have to pay very careful attention to names of characters, names of places, dates, things like that. Now we find out that the country attorney is there too, so the sheriff and the country attorney need to visit the Wrights. Given our previous thought about foreshadowing with the word scandalized, what are our expectations about this visit? Legal officials usually don't go and visit someone formally unless there are serious circumstances involved. Um, I would say we have a classic third-person narrator in this story, but up to this point, the narrator stays in Mrs. Hale's head. In other words, the narrator is seeing the world through Mrs. Hale's perspective. Will the narrator then ever shift into anyone else's head? The day that the story takes place is described as lonesome and cold. The author could have used a setting that involved any type of weather, so why lonesome and cold? Does the setting somehow work with foreshadowing here? So if you can connect these literary devices, elements, it's going to help you not only in your analysis of the story, but perhaps in a paper you might write later. And remember again, as I said with the yellow wallpaper, we should not confuse the author with the narrator. Now as we move to page 260, we find out through Mr. Hale that John Wright does not care much about what his wife wants. Could the mood that has been set be described as rather ominous? If so, why? What descriptive words and phrases could we identify that would support the claim that an ominous or a suspenseful mood has been set? Let's move to page 261. We now know in no uncertain terms that John Wright is dead from a rope around his neck. As Mr. Hale tells his story about visiting the Wrights' house the day before, what do we make of Mr. Hale's description of Mrs. Wright's behavior when she tells Mr. Hale that her husband is dead? Moving to page 264, I really think that here we gain a lot of insight into how the men in this story view the women. Is this a misogynist story? If it is not a misogynist story, why would the author include such a view of women? Also, what insight have we gained about how the women view the men? We find out on page 265 that Mrs. Hale's perception is that the Wrights' house was not a cheerful place and that its lack of cheerfulness is due to John Wright. So, given some of the remarks that Mr. Hale and Mrs. Hale have made about John Wright, what opinions can we form of John Wright and, by extension, Minnie Wright? Page 266. The women now speak more freely after the men leave the room. Up to now, we've probably rendered some initial judgment about the Wrights' marriage, but given the fact that Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters speak more freely when their husbands are not present, what does this suggest about their marriages? We can ask also, what does this suggest about society during the time that the story was written? What does this suggest about gender role constructs and expectations during the time the story was written? And do the answers to those two questions I just posed about society during the time the story was written, what gender roles were like during the time the story was written, do those questions help us come to an answer to the question about, is this a misogynist story, or is it just set in the times? You have to decide. Another point to consider is at the top of page 266, The country attorney states that Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters might come upon some clue that will help to establish motive. Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters then now know exactly what the country attorney and the sheriff are looking for. They're looking for motive, aren't they? Okay, page 267. Who's the main character in this story is the question I want to pose at this point. And this main character question, it's always one that we want to answer for ourselves. It's usually best answered by figuring out whose head the narrator is in. So refer back to my note on the text lecture about page 257 and then reread page 267. And now consider again how the narrator tells the story through Mrs. Hale's eyes, through her consciousness or point of view. So who's the story's protagonist? If the narrator stays in only one character's head at a time, what we would have in terms of a narrator would be a limited, omniscient narrator. But perhaps we should withhold final judgment on that, pending a note I'm going to give you about page 278, and I'll get to that in just a minute or two. There is an interesting moment that occurs, and it relates to the narrator being in Mrs. Hale's head. Um, it's a moment that relates on the text lecture to point D for page 266. Glassbill writes, and I quote here, she didn't want Mrs. Peters to get that feeling she had got of work begun and then, for some reason, not finished. Now, why do I bring that up? Well, in other words, Mrs. Hale had gotten the feeling that Minnie Wright started some work and left it unfinished, as though something interrupted Minnie Wright. Mrs. Hale perhaps fears that the unfinished work could be seen as a clue to the possibility that Minnie Wright left the work so that she could murder John Wright. Moreover, Mrs. Hale does not want Mrs. Peters to reach that same conclusion because Mrs. Peters is the sheriff's wife. So clearly, Mrs. Hale understands the gravity of any clue that points to Mrs. Wright, and she understands the gravity of how much the sheriff and the country attorney need to find that motive. Okay, let's shift over to page 268. It's on this page that Mrs. Hale apparently realizes for the first time that it is indeed possible Minnie Wright killed her husband. But can this really be the first moment in which this occurs to her? I don't know. Interesting thought, something to think about there. Okay, let's move to page 270. Minnie Wright's stove is in very bad shape. So she was basically expected to do her job as the cook in the Wright family, but she doesn't have good tools. One wonders if John Wright, her husband, could or would be able to do his job with poor tools. And the fact that perhaps he expects his wife to be able to do that might inform us to some degree about John Wright. Page 271. The men belittle the women again, this time over the women's curiosity about whether Minnie Wright's sewing was going to be quilted or knotted. After the men leave, though, the women discover that Minnie Wright's sewing had suddenly turned from sewing that was quite skilled to something that yielded a product that was chaotic. We might ask ourselves who the effective detectives are in this story, the women or the men? Okay, shifting to page 272, from here really through page 276, the women are coming upon more clues, such as the birdcage door being broken. And on 276, that's where the women find Minnie Wright's bird, its neck wrung. 277. From here through the remainder of the story, the women hide behind their gender-imposed identities by talking about Minnie Wright knotting the quilt, fully knowing that this will cause the men to pay little to no attention to them. They want attention drawn away from themselves, and they succeed. In a strange twist, although the women have been gendered into a position of weakness, they now use that weakened position to their strength, right? To make the men pay no attention to them. So how does this perhaps reflect Minnie's state of being? On page 278, regarding whether or not the narrator can best be described as limited omniscient, there's this. It's a quote from the story. It was as if something within her, not herself, had spoken, and it found in Mrs. Peters something she did not know as herself. So here, with that line, the narrator knows what is in Mrs. Peters' head. Is this the first instance where the narrator shifts into a consciousness other than Mrs. Hale's? If so, what does this do to our analysis in terms of pinning down what type of narrator is at work in this story? Okay, I'm going to leave A Jury of Her Peers at that, and once again, I hope that you found these video lecture notes helpful. Thank you.